All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to go over a phenomenon that I call the superconscious mind. Right. So before getting into it, though, I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. Right. So this concept that I call the superconscious mind, when I was writing it in the book, right, it was a highly theoretical concept. So it was basically an idea I came up with that I theorized as a consequence of the concept of transcendental connection, right? And it's actually not super consequential to what we're going to talk about in the next couple of chapters, because those really hinge on the concept of transcendental connection. But this is more of a theoretical consequence of it that I just happen to be thinking about, right? But what was actually interesting is that originally the book was actually meant to end at chapter 8 of book 2. And so I had a spiritual experience right, when I started. It's actually related to what I talked about with the sleep apnea experience. And from that experience, I started watching a whole bunch of spiritual videos online, really near-death experience videos, and people who had experiences where they speak to higher beings, God and higher beings. And from those videos, what I actually noticed is a lot of them actually talk about what I theorize to be the superconscious mind. In other words, those videos actually seem to confirm a lot of what I was saying. So it was kind of interesting. So it lent more credence to this idea. Because like I said, this idea is highly theoretical, so I'm kind of making some guesses when I put it together. So just to be clear, I don't believe that it is as put together as the theory was for book 1, right? So in book 1, I set it up like a real theory. So I basically started with a set of axioms, and the whole theory builds itself off those set of axioms. That's how a real theory works. Like physics is like that. In this book, in book 2, where a lot of what I say is going to be based on my experience, and I believe the experience that other people will talk about in terms of their relationship with God and some other things. However, there's still some degree of, there's still going to be a degree of, I believe, of putting theory together on the basis of axioms, specifically transcendental connection for most of the book too. But this concept, I don't do it as much, but like I said, I believe it lends some of its validity toward what a lot of people say in near-death experience videos, what they're told. So yeah, I just wanted to say that to get that out of the way, that this is a highly theoretical concept, but I believe it's correct. And we're going to actually talk about the consequences of this in detail in chapters, a little bit in chapter 9, but especially in chapter 10. All of chapter 10 is basically going to be a larger consequence of this concept. All right, so to get into it, we're basically talking about what the superconscious mind is. So in the last video, we basically talked about transcendental connection, right? So that's basically, just to recap a little bit, it's basically the ability the subconscious has to connect, to increase its connection to different things in nature, different things in the universe, right? So I can charge my subconscious to increase my connection to something, and then when my subconscious discharges, that connection decreases. And the more my subconscious is connected, transcendentally connected to something, the more it behaves in the likeness of whatever I connected to. Now, to go over this first point, it says that all people and all living things on the planet are connected at the subconscious level. Now, technically, you could say all living things and all planets across the universe, right? But to keep it simple, we're just going to say the living things on this planet, and we're going to really look at people for a moment. But to go on, it says this forms a special field in the metaphysical reality called the superconscious. So one other thing I kind of want to say is that the superconscious, when I was watching a lot of those videos, they call the superconscious, the term that they use for superconscious is actually called the higher self. So, which I actually think that's a better, more accurate term. But I already started using it to refer to the subconscious field that I speak about here. So that's just one thing I want to mention. We actually talk about the higher self also in chapter 9 and 10. But I'm going to keep calling it the superconscious. So, like I said, the connection, all people are connected at the subconscious level, and this forms a special field in metaphysical reality called the superconscious. So, how can I break that down a little bit more? To basically understand that a little bit more, I want to talk about what a field is, because that's really what I'm referring to. And a field is more of a physics-based term. Now, I haven't taken classical field theory or quantum field theory, so I'm not like an expert on the concept of fields. I am aware of some concepts like the setting up the Lagrangian of a field, and the particle moving in a field, and Lagrangian density, things like that. But still, I'm going to talk about what I believe a field is based on my experience with physics. So a field essentially is, in the physicists can fact check me, but field essentially just a region of space. Very simply, right? So a field is a region of space, or you can call it a manifold, right? And it's just in physics, there would be a utility in describing a special region of space which has certain objects. There would be certain objects within that space that have certain properties, right? And it'll be useful to describe those set of objects within that location of space using the term field. So, for example, you can have a vector field, right? So a vector field would be just some region of space, a random region of space or a manifold, and every object that's in that region of space or that field would be a vector, right? So it wouldn't be a scalar, it wouldn't be different types of tensors or whatever. Like, see, my drawing is horrible, right? So these are meant to be arrows, but it's kind of hard to, but you get the picture. So they're vectors, which is a one tensor, right? Ignoring how they transform, but there'll be a one tensor, specifically a vector. And in physics, a vector is a object or a quantity that has both magnitude and direction. In math, if you want to get really sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Technical about it, or pedantic about it, in mathematics, they would use different rules, like how it transforms, and if you add it in certain ways, it's part of the vector space, and things like that. But in physics, they keep it simple and just say it's a quantity that has magnitude and direction. So, for example, a moving air mass, right, which is what they do in meteorology, when you study moving air masses and calculate the weather and things like that, that would be a vector field, right? So you take a random region of space in which air is moving, and you would define the air in terms of its direction and some magnitude about, air pressure, I don't know, something like that. But you would use a vector field to describe it. So, and then there's also the concept of electric field. So electric field is just in physicists, they already know all of this, but this is for people not used to these ideas. A vector field would just be electric field would just be a field that has a set of charged particles inside, right? Those charged particles exert a force outward, radially outward. I can't make arrows that well, but it exerts force radially outward, and any charged particle that interacts with that field is going to experience a force exerted on it. If it's a non-charged particle, it won't experience a field. But basically, this would be an example of a vector field. That would be an electric field. So just a region of space with specific type of objects in it. So when we think about when we're going back to the subconscious, when we think about the set of subconscious minds, right, all across the planet, which are all connected to each other, what that technically forms, this is how I see it, it forms a subconscious field, right? So now the subconscious is metaphysical, right? So we talked about that. It is not, you can't put the subconscious on a table and look at it take measurements with it, with physical instruments, right? It is metaphysical or supernatural in nature, right? So it exists in the metaphysical realm. So, in theory, if you take a certain space, now space, I imagine, space-time works a little differently in the metaphysical realm from this realm. But just to keep things simple and to project our experience onto the metaphysical realm, we can think of it as the space, right, of Earth, the whole planet, consists of a collection of all types of subconscious minds, right? And so what that forms is a subconscious field. So the whole planet Earth has what I call a subconscious field grid, or a subconscious field around it, that consists of the collection of subconscious minds. And all those subconscious minds are affecting each other. And what I really call that is the superconscious, the collection of that, basically that whole subconscious field grid. So how does the superconscious, what makes the superconscious special to study, right? Assuming this theoretical field exists, right? What makes this field so special and interesting to study? How does it affect the behavior of a single subconscious mind, which is what we're mostly interested in, right? Or we can even say, how does it affect the sort of, well, that really gets into the concept of manifestation, which we'll talk about later. But I was going to say, we can talk about how it affects sort of the behavior of a large group of people. That this field also is responsible for that. But for the moment, we're just going to kind of look at a more smaller scale for it. But to go over this next point, it says that each subconscious mind interacts with the superconscious in a similar manner to charged particles in an electric field. So basically what I'm getting at there is that the superconscious affects the each person's subconscious mind, but each person's subconscious mind also has a how do I want to word it? It has an effect, a total effect on the superconscious, right? It has some effect on the superconscious, such that when you add the collection of subconscious minds, you can kind of see the aggregate effect. And that's like really exactly how charged particles work in an electric field. So let's say that I have a, just to go back to the board here, let's say I have a electric field here, right? So this is just a region of space, and let's say there's a charged particle, let's call it positive, and it's 5 coulombs, right? So a coulomb is a unit in physics which you would use to measure charge, right? So let's say there's a region of space that has 5 coulombs, and it consists of only positively charged particles. So they're all repelling each other, right? But they're stuck in space in that location. Now, if I put another charged particle here, no need to give it a measurement, but let's say it's 1 coulomb, right? And I put it right here. Now, this particle is going to experience a force from this electric field, from the 5 coulombs, and it's going to experience a repulsion force. So it's going to push that object. So it's going to push this charge away. Now, let's say I bring another particle, right, very close to it, which is negatively charged. Not that it matters, but I bring a negatively charged particle of 1 coulomb here. Well, it's now going to also experience a force from that electric field, a highly attractive force. But what I really want to get at is this particle would experience a force from this field that would be different from what it would experience if this particle wasn't here, right? So in other words, the moment I enter this particle into the field, it changes everything. It changes the effect that this field will have on any other particle that the field is affected by. And by the same token, if I increase the charge of this particle, so right now it's minus 1 coulomb, let's say I make it minus 2 coulombs, it's going to affect the whole field in such a way where even the particles here, the force on them would be a little different. So the particles inside this original field. And what I'm saying overall is that the field is unique, right? So every particle that makes up the field affects the field in a way where now the field is, the effect of the field is now unique relative to any new particle that enters that field. And so the subconscious world grid, or the superconscious, works exactly the same way. Every person's subconscious is weakly connected to every other person's subconscious, and it's like at a subconscious level where our subconscious minds are all trying to imitate each other, right? So that's basically what we said happens when your subconscious transcendentally connects to something. It imitates it in a sense. So my subconscious is trying to imitate your subconscious, what it's doing. Both our subconscious minds are trying to imitate 2 other random people's subconscious minds, right? And they're all kind of copying each other. Now, like we said, that the effect is usually so small and so weak that it's largely negligible, and you can ignore it in terms of analyzing subconscious behavior or trying to understand it. But that effect can increase, which is why this learning about this stuff is important. So the subconscious, basically what's going on in the superconscious is always how do I want to word it? The activity in the superconscious, right? Which is just the collection of all of our subconscious minds. That activity is unique, and what it does is relative to what each person's subconscious mind is doing, right? So now I want to get into kind of how the superconscious affects an individual subconscious mind more specifically. So going over it here, it reads, energy in the superconscious has an ambient pressure-like effect on the subconscious, so one person's subconscious mind, similar to the effect of mood. So this is very important because what basically I'm getting at, and I'll go into I'll give a more descriptive definition of that in terms of subconscious memory in a moment. But the superconscious also has a quality of energy to it, or has a characteristic of energy. Just like your subconscious mind has energy, so does the superconscious. It has energy. Now, when the superconscious charges energy, right, what that actually does is it produces a kind of ambient effect or ambient pressure on the subconscious mind of every subconscious that makes up that superconscious field or is a part of it. Just like the electric field, right, that's here, every particle that's a part of this electric field will experience a force by that electric field, and as that electric field goes stronger, every charged particle experiences a stronger force on it. Now, so just to give an example, let's take a highly localized field. So you can think of the superconscious field across the whole planet, so the collection of all our subconscious minds being connected to each other. You can think of that as a global field, right? Now, a highly localized field would just consist of a set of much smaller set of subconscious minds. So let's say we have a house, right? So there's a house that consists of 5 people, right? So it's a highly localized subconscious field, and the subconscious field of that house has 5 subconscious minds in it. So all those subconscious minds are connected, transcendentally connected to each other, and they're all trying to copy each other, right? So how would this subconscious field get energy or get more energy in it? In a way that makes more sense to talk about in the superconscious level rather than just a local subconscious level for one person's subconscious mind. Well, here's how I like to think of it. Here's how I kind of define it. So if everyone in the house and everyone in the home, their subconscious minds are imitating each other, let's say, or they're impacting each other, let's say one person charges their subconscious at the inner peace frequency. So they charge a huge amount of peace. Well, what effect will that have on everyone else that's a part of that field? Well, if they're copying each other and they're transcendentally connected within this field, then everyone else should have their subconscious mind should try to imitate that, right? So it should have a higher affinity for charging the feeling of peace. Or putting it another way, it's going to experience a pressure-like effect similar to mood. So just like when you're in the mood, when your short-term subconscious memory is charged at a specific frequency, but you're not focused on the subject or the set of subjects that carry that charge, the subconscious memory switches to a passive state, and you'll be in the mood to charge more of that feeling, that frequency. You'll be in the mood to charge that frequency. And so the same thing, I believe, happens in this case. So if you have a very local subconscious field, right, with 5 people in it, let's say 2 people now, or 3 people charge the inner peace frequency, and they charge it to really intense levels. Well, if the theory of transcendental connection is correct, then the other people their subconscious mind should be trying to copy that, right? And now one thing we can say is that if those other 2 people who haven't done this, if they increase their connection to the 3 other people, then they'll experience a higher affinity for charging the feeling of inner peace. But we'll talk a little more about that in this next part. For now, let's just say the connection's fixed. So presumably, the more these people charge the feeling of peace, the higher the affinity still of those original two people's subconscious mind is going to be to charge the feeling of inner peace too. Again, we'll break that down a little bit more here. But that's the theory, right? So that's the theory so far. And if those two people do decide to charge inner peace, what's actually going to happen is because of that pressure coming from the other three people who are charging that frequency, they'll experience a kind of boost. So they'll have an even easier time charging the feeling of inner peace. And now that everyone's charging the feeling of inner peace, right, they're all kind of boosting each other's ability to charge it. And there's kind of a resonant-like effect, right? So we kind of seen that same effect when we talked about deep charging, right? So when you have when your mood is at a certain frequency, that actually boosts your ability to perform a main charge. And now you can charge even more intensely. So a similar effect happens when you charge your subconscious at a frequency that matches the energy of the superconscious, right? So just to break it down again, if I'm in a local subconscious field within a house and there's 5 people in it, if let's say 4 of those people charge their subconscious at the peace frequency to very high and intense amounts, that 5th person will experience a kind of pressure or ambient kind of pressure to charge the feeling of inner peace. Now they don't have to, but they're going to feel a little bit of pressure to do it. And when they finally do it, they're going to get a huge boost off that pressure, so they're going to have an even easier time charging, and it's going to add more subconscious. It's going to add more energy to the superconscious energy for everyone else, so everyone else have an even easier time charging once that 5th person starts charging. So this is my theory. This is what I'm believing happens within the superconscious. So now let's talk a little more about how that charging might work, right? So we're going to kind of model it after the way the subconscious mind works, right? So in other words, talking about subconscious memory. So look, to read this part, it says the superconscious has a subconscious memory system that is made up of all our subconscious memories. This allows categories to form in an emergent way. So basically what I mean by that is the superconscious mind, if we were to establish it as having a type of memory, again, this is all theoretical, right? I'm just kind of putting it together in a way that I think kind of makes sense. We would have to perform experiments of some kind or something to see if it's correct. But like I said, I believe it has a certain validity to it based on what a lot of people who have spiritual experiences, what they're told about a kind of subconscious world grid, right? So it matches what I'm saying almost exactly, right? But for the moment, if we try to model this new theory or this new type of metaphysical object, let's say it has a version of subconscious memory, right? We'll actually call it a subconscious memory system. Because in a nutshell, the subconscious memory for this system, for this object, the superconscious mind, would actually be the collection of all subconscious memories of the subconscious minds that make it up. Right? So the subconscious memory for the subconscious field, and I use the term superconscious mind or subconscious field, I use them interchangeably, or subconscious world grid, or field grid, they're all basically the same thing. But let's say you have a local subconscious field within a house, right? And there's 5 people in it. Then the subconscious memory, or the subconscious memories that make up that superconscious, or that subconscious field for the 5 people in the house, would actually be the collection of all the subconscious memories of all 5 people. So I call it a subconscious memory system to basically kind of I feel like it would just be the proper word to use, and you would organize all your subconscious memories according to each person, right? So the subconscious memory system you could think of as having 5 objects. So 1 for each person in the house, and if I focus on this object, then that would be, if I focus on object 1, then that would be able to access all the subconscious memories for person 1. If I focus on object 2, I would access all the subconscious memories for person 2. So that the whole subconscious memory system would consist of 5 objects, and each object stores all the memories according to each person. So that's kind of what I'm picturing in my head when I'm thinking about this and theorizing this. In a way, you can kind of think of it as a matrix or an array, right? You can, I guess that would be an array within an array, right? Which would be it doesn't have to be a tensor, but it would be an array that, like I said, consists of arrays. But yeah, so that's how I'm looking at it. Now, the interesting question is, can we kind of model a kind of behavior or phenomena of charging using this concept of subconscious memory or subconscious memory system, similar to what we did for the subconscious mind? So for the subconscious mind, we basically said, when it charges, there's a subconscious memory is just becoming more and more positive, right? And subconscious memory, when there's a charge, there's always some subconscious memory that carries a charge, and it when it's in an active state, it adds your subconscious compels you more powerfully according to that charge, and when it's in a passive state, it compels you less powerfully, and you'll feel that compulsion in your mood. So, can we kind of say something similar about this subconscious, this superconscious? Well, I believe we can, and the way I like to think of it is like this. So, let's say that the 5 people in the home, right? Let's say there's 5 people. Let's say they go outside, right? And they all look at a storm on the horizon, right? And they're worried the storm is very dangerous, and they're concerned about, so they focus on that storm and they charge the anxiety frequency. How does that kind of work in terms of transcendental connection and within the superconscious mind? Well, if one person charges the anxiety frequency, they add energy to that system, but more specifically, their subconscious mind is kind of storing energy in the positive memory, the subconscious memory associated with the subject, that is the storm on the horizon. And they're storing it, the energy stored in that positive memory is at the anxiety frequency. Now the interesting question is, that we know that we can presume that the other people, right, they'll experience a kind of pressure to feel anxiety too, right? However, based on transcendental connection, because their subconscious is imitating this other person's subconscious mind. So if they feel anxiety, they're going to feel a little bit of pressure or feel a slight affinity to feel anxiety. But the question that's more interesting to me is if the next person focuses on that storm, right, will they have a higher affinity for feeling anxiety, or do they have a higher affinity for feeling anxiety just in general, based on anything they look at? Right? Or does something special happen when they focus on the same thing the other person's focused on? So this is something I've thought about, and to me, I believe, right, again, this is all highly theoretical, but I believe the answer is yes. So in other words, I believe that if the next person, person 2, focuses on the same subject as person 1, or a subject like it, they'll experience a higher affinity for charging anxiety while focused on that subject versus focusing on another subject. But also, they'll still feel an ambient pressure, even if they don't focus on that subject, to charge anxiety. So what it ultimately means is that, to me, this is what I believe. So I believe that transcendental connection, right, it preserves the affinity for a particular subconscious state while focused on a particular object. So in other words, if you feel anxiety while focused on a storm, if the more connected I am to you, then I'm also going to feel a lot of anxiety while focused on, it doesn't even have to be the same storm, while just focused on the storm as well, or something that to our subconscious minds looks like the same storm. So that's very important, right? And that's why I say there's a relatively emergent effect from category, because I'm going to have, my subconscious will imitate yours, and it'll have a higher affinity for imitating it if I focus on something that's similar to what you're focused on. It doesn't even have to be the same thing. As long as it's similar, right? And we talked about subject closeness. As long as it's similar, it'll kind of do the same thing. And what that means ultimately, and this is something that's very, very special, right, is that transcendental connection, it kind of preserves subconscious volatility, right? So that's really important. It preserves subconscious volatility relative to a particular subject or category. So if the more people there are that experience anxiety while focused on a storm, right, the the more easily I'm going to be able to charge anxiety when I focus on the storm, right? And the more they charge energy of anxiety while focused on that storm, the more of a boost I'll get to charge the anxiety while focused on a storm or something that looks like what everyone else is focused on. So, in other words, my subconscious is highly volatile relative to that subject, even though I actually didn't go through the work of charging it. So before, volatility only came from a subconscious memory becoming more positive, right? Becoming more positive while I focus on something in a transcendental state. But in this case, we see something new happen, right? We see that our subconscious can become volatile, right? Not just because something's new, not because we stored positive memory, but it could become volatile simply because the people that we're connected to within the subconscious field, because they charged a lot of energy while focused on some subject or category. And that volatility allows us to charge very easily. So we can get a charging boost based on what other people are focused on when we focused on that same subject. So like I keep saying, I know it's very theoretical, right? So I'm kind of throwing a lot of things together, but this is just a theory of mine. Like I said, I make theory all day, every day, right? That's just kind of something I do. So this was just a theory I had, right? But again, it actually seemed to be confirmed in near-death experiences. So this is very important if it's true, because what it ultimately means, right? And this is something that we're going to talk a lot about in chapter 10. What it means is that you can have a concept of subjects, right, for the superconscious mind, and certain subjects can develop a lot of energy within the superconscious memory system. And in that superconscious memory system, anybody that focuses on that same subject will have a certain natural volatility, and they'll be able to charge energy faster, right? So people within some subconscious field will be able to charge energy faster and add more energy to that subconscious field, depending on what everyone else is doing, right? And if everyone else is doing something fairly similar, so if they're charging a lot of energy while focused on some particular symbol, then the whole superconscious field will actually charge, or the superconscious mind will actually charge some frequency relative to some symbol. And everyone who's part of that field will be able to kind of get a charging boost while focused on that same symbol. So as an example, if I focus on, and we can talk about religion, if I focus on Jesus, right, and we're actually going to talk about this in chapter 3, but if I focus on Jesus, right, and I charge a lot of positive energy, which for a moment we'll just say positive energy, or positive emotion, then the more people that do that while focused on Jesus, right, then some random person out of nowhere who focuses on Jesus, they're actually going to notice that they have an easier time charging that positive emotion than the rest of us. But we're helping this other person to do that, right? Now, that would be very difficult to test, right? But this is what I believe occurs. And so that's basically how the superconscious mind charges energy. That's how the subconscious memory works for the superconscious mind. And that's basically how the superconscious mind would have some particular subject that, in a sense, carries the charge, right? Or is associated with the subconscious memories that carry the charge within that subconscious memory system. And we basically talked about passive, or we talked about a kind of mood-like effect. So even if someone isn't focusing on the subject, which is associated with the subconscious memories that carry a charge, they would still experience a mood-boosting like effect, or an ambient kind of pressure on their subconscious, because they're still connected to the superconscious field. So like I said, highly theoretical, but these are the ideas that I believe are true. And to go over this last point, there are different levels of what is that? There are different levels of, sometimes I can't read my own writing, but there are different levels of connection in the superconscious. So basically what I'm getting at there is that I believe that people could be more connected and less connected as a group within a superconscious field. So they're almost like layers of connections, right? So as an example, let's say let's take all the people in the United States, right? So all the people in the United States can represent a superconscious mind or a subconscious field. So we're all connected to each other. But people in New York, right? So I'm in New York, but so all of us in New York would be probably a little more connected to each other than we would be to people in, I don't know, across the country. Even though we are all connected in the subconscious field of the United States, I'm still a little bit more connected to the people in New York. Now, why is that? And actually, before I get into it, also a larger consequence of that would be, for example, animals, right, would be more connected. Species would be more connected to each other than. There's different classifications of animals in terms of their genetic differences. So you would have like a class, a phylum. I forget, what the hierarchy of them are. But you have class, phylum, genus, something like that. But each one, species is the one with the closest genetic relationship to each other. Anyone in the same species. And a class would be less genetically related to each other. Or would consist of animals that are less genetically related to each other than a species. Now, so I believe that same kind of thing happens in the superconscious field, so on the superconscious mind. So wolves would be more transcendentally connected to each other than they would be to humans. They would still be transcendentally connected to humans, just not as much as wolves, the rest of the wolves, the wolf population. Humans would be more connected to each other than they would be connected to cats, and so on and so forth, right? And I believe a similar thing happens based on location and culture and religion. So all of us in New York are more connected to each other than we are to someone, across the country, even though we're still connected to them. Us Christians would likely be more connected to each other than, another religion, and so on and so forth. So how does that happen exactly? Where does that theory and idea come from? Well, I believe that, part of it in terms of the differences between animals and humans would ultimately come from the way our body charges our subconscious minds, right? So if our subconscious is all imitating each other to a degree, you can imagine that animals of the same species would charge their subconscious in a similar way. I believe that alone would be enough to kind of make them more similar within the subconscious field. But then also, it's also related to things we focus on. So remember what I was saying, the superconscious field also has a concept of subjects. So now, people who are connected in some way are likely to focus on the same set of subjects. If that's true, then they're likely influencing each other's subconscious minds to charge in very similar ways if they're charging the same frequency when they focus on those subjects or subjects like them. So for example, us in New York, we could travel the same roads, right? We might watch the same news or something like that. We've seen the same stores, so our subconscious is constantly focusing on the same subjects in, I imagine, having some form of similarity within that by focusing on these same subjects and having these same feelings when we focus on those same subjects. And as we have the same feelings, our subconscious imitate each other more. And like I said before, there's kind of a resonance effect, a kind of boost effect, which the more people focus on some symbol here in New York and feel the same feeling, then it affects everyone to kind of have a similar feeling, and it adds more energy to that feeling, and so the feeling grows. And ultimately, we start acting more the same way, and so that makes the connection grow. Is what I basically believe. Same thing would happen in religion. If you're in a particular religion and you focus on these same religious figures, right? Your subconscious minds would charge in a certain way by accessing the symbol in the superconscious field. All the energy in the superconscious field will give you a charging boost, and then you still add more energy to that superconscious field. Now, I wouldn't focus on these same figures as someone from another religion, right, that isn't Christian. Right? I focus on Jesus. And so I wouldn't really be adding that. I would still add a little bit of energy, but not that much energy to some other religion. So I would probably be more connected within the subconscious field to Christians than I would be to some other religion. And so on and so forth. So hopefully I explained that well, but in a nutshell, I think that there are different degrees of connection within the superconscious, right? And it can get stronger within certain sections and weaker in other sections. Like family, for example, would probably have a very strong connection in the subconscious field compared to, just people in the city. But yeah, that's pretty much it, though. I think that's all. Hopefully, I wasn't too theoretically intense, but yeah, this is my theory. So this is just, like I said, just thoughts I had. These ideas aren't hugely consequential to what we're going to talk about in the next couple of chapters, but it is going to be hugely consequential to what we talk about in chapter 10. But yeah, if it was a lot, like I said, these ideas I didn't quite put this way in the book because I refined the ideas more since I wrote it in the book. And then I kind of talk about it in more detail in chapter 9 and 10. So if it's a lot, I would just recommend to rewatch the video, kind of get an idea of it. It's not super important right now to know this, but it is going to be important for chapter 9 and 10. But that's it, though. In the next video, we're going to talk about another consequence of this, which has to do with the law of attraction, right? So I actually call it the law of manifestation, which is one of the most important laws in the metaphysical reality. Every other law is basically a consequence of the law of manifestation. But again, I talk more about that in chapter 10. There's a lot of stuff I want to cover before I go into that. But we're going to cover just the basics of it in the next video. So I'm not going to use the term that I really prefer to call it. I'm just going to kind of use the colloquial term, which I just think I think this term is not as broad as the one that I'm referring to. But it's called the law of attraction. So you've probably heard that lots of times in self-help communities and things like that. But we're actually going to talk about that in terms of the superconscious because it's actually very important. All right, but yeah, that's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.